Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. You can find us on the internet at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Virginia Miller, head and food drink writer at the SF Bay Guardian, and the perfect spot, your moderator for tonight's discussion. And now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Eric Asimov. He's the chief wine critic of the New York Times and author of How to Love Wine. Eric Asimov holds extensive knowledge about the many complexities of wine, and tonight we're here to discuss his new book, which aims to make wine accessible to the layman and the connoisseur alike, so we can all truly come to love and appreciate wine. Today we'll be addressing the ways in which to find the best and perfect wine amongst the ever-expanding universe of wines. Please welcome Mr. Eric Asimov. So Eric, it is an honor to have you here in San Francisco.
I'm so pleased to be here, and I love the gavel. I feel like I'm on Law and Order or something.
It's not quite a natural feeling, I have to say. Not for me, anyway. So I just finished reading your book myself, and I finished it on a plane yesterday and enjoyed every minute of it. And it's thought-provoking. It's an easy read as well, and it's got a lot of interesting and meaty discussions that I think we can have now today. And I first wanted to just ask, why did you write How to Love Wine, and why now? What brought you to this book?
I've been the wine critic at the Times since 2004, and naturally people want to talk to me about wine, and it seemed to take the form of people confessing their troubles to me, as if I were a shrink at a cocktail party. People would say, I like wine, but I just don't get all those flavors and aromas that everybody talks about. I don't know, maybe I just don't have the right equipment for it. And, there was a sense of anxiety and inadequacy that people were expressing to me that after a while it began to really bother me. And this is particularly so because I think right now we live in the greatest time in history to love wine. We have a greater diversity of wines available today from more places around the world, in more styles, from more grapes. And with all this pleasure available, it hurt me to see people kind of having obstacles in the way of their pleasure.
And a quote that I love near the beginning of the book is, you say wine is not the sort of thing that requires book learning, academic training, or special classes, but rather an elemental pleasure that satisfies emotionally and physically. Could you expound upon that for our audience?
Yeah. As I started to think about why people were feeling this sense of anxiety, I looked at the way our culture talks about wine and thinks about wine, tells people they ought to educate themselves about wine, and it seemed to me that we're conveying the idea to people that before they can just enjoy wine in the simplest possible way, they have to know everything there is to know about it, and essentially you have to become a connoisseur before you can just enjoy a glass of wine. And to me, that seemed backwards. In my experience, and not just with wine, with anything, if you want to take up skiing, for example, you try it out and you fall in love with it, and that's when you pursue it. Music, sports, books, art, anything. Why not in wine? You want to establish an emotional connection to wine first, fall in love with it. And then if you decide that you want to plunge in more deeply, that's the time for the books and the classes and everything else.
So how do you envision, for those of us that are already starting with the intimidation, we're hearing the noises, we're hearing everybody's opinion about wine, and we're not confident in our own. How do we start and just get that pure appreciation and pleasure in it?
Well, that is the question, and it's not a simple answer as much as we want it to be. One of the common themes that you see in the literature about wine is attempts to demystify wine. as if it's all of these words and the nomenclature we use simply fog everything up, and that in reality it's a simple thing. And that's not true, really. The pleasures, the initial pleasures from wine are very simple. All you have to do is drink it and enjoy it, and you know, what could be simpler than that? But that's really just the beginning of it. And you know, demystification suggests that that's where it ends. And the fact is that wine, at its heart, really is a mystery. As much as we know about the scientifically about how wine is made and the fermentation, which was a mystery for so many millennia, is now understood for maybe less than a century. There's a lot of things about wine that we don't understand. We don't understand how it ages, how it changes, why certain processes take place, why certain flavors are in the wine, where they come from. So to demystify wine, or to suggest that you can, in the end, it doesn't square with people's experience of something that is mysterious.
In fact, in the book, you do get into the need all of us have for certainty, or the longing we have, rather, I should say, than a need. We want things to be certain and spelled out in black and white, but the opposite of that would be doubt and uncertainty, which you're saying are friends, essentially, of wine, or there is doubt and uncertainty.
Well, you know, we've just all been through the ordeal of the presidential election and political commercials and that sort of thing, and, you know, you can't, doubt never creeps into politics, because, you know, that would cause an extreme dislocation. But the world is an uncertain place, and if you're being honest about issues and processes in the world, you have to look at the complexities. You have to look at both sides. You can't be certain about things, and certainly not about something as complicated as wine. You have to allow that, you know, instead of predicting that this wine is going to be just right to drink 3 years from now, you have to allow that that's a guess. And I don't think it's good for the business of being a wine critic to allow that. You know, you don't want to undermine your own authority, but you have to ask, why are people so desperate for this daddy-like authority when it comes to wine?
It's true, and the guides that a lot of us go to are tasting notes, blind tastings, or we're relying on blind tastings from the experts, wine ratings, and you get into all of these in your book, and I think it's some of the most interesting passages. One of my favorite quotes is, at best, tasting notes are a waste of time. At worst, they are pernicious. And I thought maybe we could dive right in and discuss tasting notes, blind tastings, and the rest.
Well, when I started to think about why people were experiencing this sense of intimidation, and it's nothing new. Everybody in the wine industry understands that the public is intimidated by wine. I started thinking about the way we talk about it. And it's always in the flowery language of tasting notes. And some of the, I will say that there are wine writers who have been making fun of wine tasting notes forever. It's just perfect grist for satire, and so it's nothing new to take them on. But I think people sort of wave off the criticism, and if you really look deeply at tasting notes, you have to ask yourself if they actually convey anything useful about wine whatsoever. If you look at a description, you know, this wine tastes like black cherry, but this one tastes like raspberry, and this wine tastes like a combination of the two, and the fourth wine tastes like boysenberries and cloudberries, or whatever. Would you make a buying decision based on the various incremental berry differences? Probably not. Nor would you be able to taste those differences in the wine. If you look at if you take any three wine critics who use tasting notes and compare their notes on a single wine, their references are completely different. I mean, this is a fact. And you're taking, it's one glass of wine, but you've got completely different descriptions. So what do any of them mean? If you take three different wines from one critic, they'll use the same references time and time again. You know, this wine tastes like fig compote and tobacco. That one tastes like fig cake and pipe tobacco. The third one tastes like melted fig compote. You know, so the differences are so incremental, but in the end, they don't speak to the way we experience wine at a dinner table, at a restaurant, with a loved one. There are so many more elements that help us to understand what a wine is about.
And in the case of wine ratings as well, you get into that as well.
Wine ratings, yes. Now, I'm completely sympathetic to the need for wine rating, or the yearning for wine ratings. That comes under the heading of certainty. You go into a wine shop and you're confronted with the walls and shelves of wines, and each bottle requires a significant outlay. And who wants to waste money? So we've got this new system. This wine is 85 and this wine is 88 and that wine is 92. Aha, I know what I'm going to buy. And there's no doubt there. You have advanced knowledge that your money is going to be well spent. But if you think about how those ratings are awarded, you've got a critic sitting in a clinical environment, say, and you've got the 50 or 75 glasses of wine lined up under the Klieg lights of, usually reserved for interrogations. And, you've cut off the music because you need to be in a sensory deprivation mode. You didn't brush your teeth or drink coffee because that would influence your tasting. And then you've got to come up with these tasting notes and these rankings, and you taste and spit and move on to the next one. But how is that related to the way anybody actually drinks wine? It's not at all. When you have a bottle of wine, it's going to change over time as it ages in the bottle. If you pour it in the glass, it's going to change in the glass as it's exposed to air, as the temperature of the wine changes. Depending on what food you serve with it, your experience of the wine is going to be different. Your mood, did you just have a fight with your spouse, or is it a romantic evening, or did you come home from a hard day and you need a drink? Or, there's any number of reasons that you're sitting down to have a glass of wine. And all of these elements create a context that it influences what we're going to drink. And the conditions in that tasting room, where they might have well been, rating toasters on the darkness of the toast, or going 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds, it doesn't apply. So again, you've got our primary ways of talking about wine, the tasting notes that don't match people's own experiences of the wine. And then you've got the ratings, and you've chosen the 92-point wine, but you've made meatloaf at home or something, and you've got this tannic Cabernet that's going to age for 5 years, but is awful with the meatloaf, where you could have had this 85-point wine from southern Italy that's just beautiful right now and goes with that food. You've got these experiences that don't match up with our reality, and most people end up blaming themselves because, after all, we don't have what it takes, and they're experts, and they know. So the first thing we have to do is not kill all the lawyers, but figuratively eliminate the authorities, put the authorities somewhere else, at least these big central voices. My solution, which I talk about in the book, if you want to figure out how you feel about wine, is what I call the home wine school, where essentially you adopt a new best friend, the wine merchant at your local, at the best shop nearby. Because wine merchants are like sommeliers, and they both remind me of reference librarians. They love what surrounds them, and if they can get you as a captive audience, they're going to talk your ear off and tell you about everything that they love, and they want to turn you on to their passion, which happens to be the wines that they know better than somebody who's writing from a great distance. And what I suggest doing is making a small investment, deciding on a budget for a case of wine, 12 bottles, and tell the merchant to mix up a box. He'll probably, or she will probably ask you some questions about the wine, about your own tastes, and which you may or may not be able to answer, but it doesn't matter, because you'll take home a box of 12 different bottles, and over time, you'll open a bottle every night with dinner, maybe, or whatever is comfortable with you, twice a week. And there's a little bit of work involved. You take some notes on it, your own reaction to these wines. Maybe you'll find that this is boring and you're really not that interested, which is okay, because nobody is really obliged to learn about wine. But if you find yourself interested, then you have an opportunity to gather your own thoughts, go back to the merchant when that first box is finished, and do it again based on what you found the first time. And the repeated acquisition of these cases of wine and your own thoughts about them will tell you whether this is something that you're at all interested in pursuing, in which case then there are other things you can do. You can, let's say you found out that you loved Pinot Noir from the Santa Cruz Mountains. Now I'm going to buy 12 bottles of that kind of wine and sort of really get deep into this narrow field. Or it could be from anywhere. Or maybe that's the time to get a book or take a class or something, because you know that this is something that you really want to do, and now it's an act of volition rather than an act of obligation.
You do touch on in your book finding the right merchant.
Well, that's
that?
always that's always the trick.
Yeah.
But as interest in this country grows in wine, the number of great wine shops is exploded exponentially. And I don't know if you've ever read the book or saw the movie High Fidelity, and you remember what indie record shops were like in the old days. And you just get these guys who were all geeked out on records and music, and if you play guitar and have been to a guitar shop, you know how those people are. That's the way it is in wine shops, except it's considerably less intimidating, because it just is, trust me. And I know certainly in New York, you find great wine shops in the most unlikely neighborhoods that 20 years ago, it would never occur to anybody. You might have a little place to get half pints behind the bulletproof glass, but
right.
Now you've got great wine shops in the Lower East Side and in Harlem and Bed-Stuy and all points in Brooklyn and Queens. And it's fantastic.
This does seem the appropriate time to bring up a question from the audience, which is, I have a self-imposed cap of $10 a bottle. Am I hopeless, or are there good wines available at this price? As we're talking about tasting and experimenting on our own.
Well, the cap is a tough thing. We're all bound by our budgets, and there's nothing you can do about that. I would say that, yes, there are $10 bottles that can be good. We talked about we talked about science and how much more we know about wine than we did 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. And 100 years ago, a lot of the wine that was made was frankly awful. It was flawed somehow, just in the making, or spoiled in transport or whatever. Nowadays, we know so much that there should never be a such thing as a bad wine anymore. The problem now is that there are a lot of boring wines, and that's especially true at that level under $10, where much of the wine is going to be mass-produced. And the analogy is to think of food. If you want to go to an inexpensive restaurant, many of your options are going to be franchise restaurants or fast food restaurants where, yeah, you can have a filling meal, but it may not be an exciting or interesting meal. Mm-hmm. And the same, sadly, is true with wine. I have found that the really sweet spot now for value is like $15 to $20, and if you can afford that much for a bottle, you're going to find an enormous number of fascinating wines. For $10, unfortunately, it's a little bit tougher.
Now, going back to the tasting notes and the critics and the voices and kind of tuning that out, doesn't that essentially put you out of a job?
Well, I hope that that's not the message that I'm right. conveying to people in my writing in the Times. I'm trying to get past tasting notes, and it's not hard because it's ingrained in us because we've learned about wine by reading those sorts that sort of wine writing. But when you think about it, there's a lot more out there. One of the things that really bothers me about tasting notes, going beyond what I said before, is that the process isolates wine to only what's in the glass. And from the Consumer Reports point of view, that's all that matters, only what's in the glass. That way, if we don't know who produced it, where it came from, how much it costs, we're not affected by bias. Mm-hmm. And as a writer, I find that infantilizing. I think, why aren't movie reviewers forced to review a movie without knowing who directed it? Mm-hmm. So they can't look at the credits, or why aren't they given books with the cover torn off and all information masked so they're not influenced by what they know? No, because it's ridiculous. You want to bring your knowledge of context of a director's predilections and past work, of an author's influences. That helps you make sense of what you're tasting. And good wine is not just it's not just a beverage, and this makes it almost unique in terms of beverages. It's really an expression of culture. People have been making wine in some places for thousands of years, and it's the product of the soil in which the grapes are grown, the place and the community, the people who make it. And if you ignore all these things, you're missing out on a significant part of what makes wine fascinating.
Yeah, and you mentioned at one point too, I was going to say I had that here in my notes about community, community being such a crucial piece of wine, that it should express that versus a commercial, I'm looking for my notes here, I had it there somewhere, but versus a commercial voice, it should express a community or a people.
Well, that's the ideal in wine, and there are a lot of wines that still can do that. But again, I would use the food analogy. The great mass of food that's produced in this country, or probably in most places in the world, is a product of big agriculture or big farming, big meat production or whatever, and it's a mass-produced commodity. And I think in the last 30 years, we've all learned about not just the benefits, but the joys of locally produced foods, of careful agriculture and conscientious humanitarian raising of animals and things like that. And a lot of that applies to wine as well. You have your mass production wines, which are sound and occasionally enjoyable beverages, but then you also have wines that are products of conscientious points of view. It's like comparing the chef who has created a menu and a style of cooking, and people are drawn to that because it's distinctive. Some people are also drawn to the franchise places that are basically trying to figure out what focus groups want and then providing it, and that's fine. But if you care about food or if you care about wine, then you're going to leave that behind and look for those more personal points of view.
I think one of the great examples of a story behind the wine you brought up locally here near us is the Mathiasen family.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know there's a lot of old world examples, but there's stories here in our area that are...
Well, yeah, it's interesting because right in the heart of Napa Valley, and there's probably no what marketers now would call a brand. There's no brand that's more powerful in American wine than Napa Cabernet. Mm-hmm. And in some cases that has become this kind of monochromatic emblem of wines that on the one hand can be fantastic and utterly distinctive, but on the other hand can also represent a different point of view, a kind of a privileged, entitled position. Well, we're from Napa, so it must be great. And the Mathiasens were fascinating to me because they make wines that are first of all, they don't hew to the Napa Cabernet mold. This is a family. Steve Mathiasen is a grape consultant, a vineyard consultant, and as he consults with vineyards, he finds little patches of grapes that are interesting to him. He also has his own small vineyard in a back road outside of the city of Napa. It's not like a faux chalet or wannabe villa. It's just a house with a tumble-down barn, and they also grow their own fruits and vegetables, which they sell at the market, and they raise animals, which they eat, and they make wine. And to me, it's a fascinating kind of tie to the way wine was for thousands of years in the old world. It was just part of a subsistence farming where you, as a farmer, if you lived in a grape-growing area, you had your grains, you had your vegetables, you raised a few animals, and maybe you had some vines in a nearby vineyard. You either made the wine yourself or you brought it to the local co-op. And, this was wine. It was your community beverage, safer than water. And there might have been a few exceptions that were internationally commercial, like Bordeaux or Burgundy, but in most of the hills and valleys and villages in Europe, that's what you had. And now you've got this right in the middle of Napa Valley, using grapes like Ribolla Gialla which is a grape from northeastern Italy, or Refusco, another grape from that same area, and they're really good wines.
So in light of this, and I think this touches on the struggle between New World and Old World in general, which is a whole other subject, but what do you see the role of the wine regions of California in the current climate today? Because obviously we are here, and in Northern California in particular, wine is very important to most of us, and we're kind of past the early days of infancy, but where are we going? Where can we go next?
Well, for me, this is a really exciting time in the history of California wine, the truncated history, because if you think about California wine had a really natural beginning when immigrants from old world wine producing areas came here and they wanted to essentially reproduce facets of their culture and planted grapes and treated wine as they did in the old world. But Prohibition completely cut off the birth of California wine. And when it started up again much later, it was kind of a less natural, organic beginning. It was now kind of motivated by commercial interests to a great extent. Big companies like Gallo, for example, dominated California wine for a long time. And then you had the rise of modern California wine in the 70s, Napa, Sonoma, a few other regions. And most recently, in the era of the cult Cabernets, you had a kind of a homogenization of styles where, although California wine was never as narrow stylistically as a lot of people have said, most critics only paid attention to one sort of big, powerfully fruity style, and that became the dominant, critically acclaimed style. But in the last 10 years, you've seen a tremendous divergence, both in the styles of wine, more restraint, less power, the sorts of grapes that are being used. There's a vanguard now that, like the Mathiasins, are exploring different kinds of grapes that are outside that Cabernet, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel orthodoxy. And I think it's tremendously exciting. It's happening in Napa, it's happening in Sonoma especially, Mendocino, Central Coast, all over.
Yeah, I've noticed that change myself just the last few years. There's so much more of an alternate voice, if you will.
It's really exciting. I had a wine just the other day, and it's an evocative name, Martian Ranch. It's down in Santa Barbara County, and they were making an Albarino, but it's a really good Albarino. And you have to credit somebody like Randall Graham from Bonnie Doon, who kind of embodied experimentalism, not always successfully, but he did his own Albarino and Nebbiolo, and there are guys like Jim Clendenin down in Au Bon Climat in Santa Barbara who've been doing things like that on a small scale. But people are taking it more seriously now, and winemakers like Martian Ranch or Arnott Roberts, mostly in Sonoma, Copan, they have established enough credibility with a significant enough clientele that when they go out on a limb and make a Trousseau wine, an obscure grape from the Jura in eastern France, people are willing to check it out and find out that it's really good. And to me, that's incredibly exciting, because that's what we have in front of us from all over the world, not just the wines from the benchmark regions, but now from different regions of France, like the Jura that we never paid attention to before, Sicily in Italy, great, Slovenia. These are amazing wines, and Hungary, the entire former communist bloc is becoming reacquainted with their old winemaking traditions.
Yeah, it's exciting to see a lot of those Eastern European wines come to the forefront. And I did notice a couple questions about that too. People were just asking some of your thoughts on Slovenian wines compared to Croatian, et cetera.
Well, now you're
which
like
we could
really
get
parsing.
into. Yeah. So the interest is there. I was going to say in the Bay Area, we drink a lot of Eastern European wines as well. But I know there's so many people around us just in the industry on every front, from sommeliers to merchants, et cetera. And as we're talking about all this, I can't help but think to going back to the approachable aspect. How do we find these stories, these unique styles of wine? How do we find that again without getting intimidated? How does the layperson go back to all this and sift through all the things that are happening in the wine world?
Well, it's easy to say, but an open mind is essential. And we've all been in the situation where you go to a restaurant and there's that dish there that you love, and you're kind of, you always want to order the same thing, and it's the same thing in wine. I know I love Beaujolais, so why shouldn't I drink that all the time? But no, because there's so much else out there. There's so many interesting wines that it's you just have to prepare yourself to be excited rather than disappointed.
For the discovery, the adventure.
Yeah, that's what it is, really. I mean,
that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
You can spend a year just tasting wines or drinking wines from every region of Spain, regions that are completely unfamiliar. I'm just going to tell one story.
Yes.
There's in eastern Galicia, which is in the western tip of Spain, almost north of Portugal. They've grown grapes there for such a long time. There are these amazing cliffs in the region of Ribera Sacra that just come almost right up from the ocean at astonishing angles. And the Romans, when they marched through there 2,000 years ago on the same route that many people take on religious pilgrimages across northern Spain, carved these terraces on the hillside so they could grow grapes there, because this is what they required to be Romans, And for centuries, people made wine there. And in the 20th century, the tradition began to die out. Partly, it was because of civil war there, and great poverty and dictatorship under Franco, but modernization as well. The wines that people made just were consumed in the villages there, or maybe sent up the river to the big city. And it was backbreaking labor. Who wanted to do that work, to sell wine to your neighbor? I mean, it didn't make sense to a lot of young people who, like young people all over Europe after World War II, left the farm, moved to the city, maybe tried to become a lawyer or an accountant or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so these terraces, these historic terraces, were abandoned. In fact, that's the word that the Spanish word abandido, I think it's something like that. You'll have to trust me. Spanish is not my second language. But in the last generation, as wine has become a more global phenomenon, you've seen these local wines, formerly local wines, suddenly become in demand halfway around the world. Mm-hmm. And it's happened in different regions in Spain, a little bit slower than in Italy or in France. But these guys who went to become accountants dropped it and came back to the farm and started rehabilitating these terraces, because suddenly they saw a path in front of them where agriculture could lead to money. Mm-hmm. They could sell their wine to people overseas. And it's happened so recently in Ribera Sacra that when you visit there, you still meet the older generation that's like, they can't believe it. People are drinking their wine in Japan and San Francisco and New York, and it's incredible to them. But it's now given agriculture a reason to be rejuvenated. And it's happening all over the world.
Absolutely. And we need to take just a moment for our radio audience. Say you're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and our guest today is Eric Asimov, chief wine critic of the New York Times and author of How to Love Wine. I'm Virginia Miller, head food and drink writer at the SF Bay Guardian, and we'll get right back in here. The questions are coming a lot too, just on personal tasting. People are asking about the difference between a $1,000 bottle or a $100 bottle and a $20 bottle. So there's still a lot of that focus. So does price matter?
You know, that's an important question, and the difference is inversely proportional to how much money you have in your bank account. You know, if you're a zillionaire, there is no difference. If you don't have a lot of money, I mean, a $1,000 bottle is you know, it's just out of unimaginable. But that being said, and I should say there's no direct correlation between price and bottle, but occasionally there is. And I think back, you know, when I was first learning about wine in the late 70s and 80s, you would meet these guys that they were just sort of reminisce about the case of 61 Latour that, you know, they bought for $25, and you're like banging your head against the wall because that was a classic vintage of great Bordeaux that, you know, in the 80s would then cost hundreds of dollars. And I remember wanting to buy a 30th anniversary wine from my parents in 1985. I had never had a great bottle of wine, so I thought this was the opportunity because I needed to have that, and I thought they would enjoy it too. And so I found a bottle of through a guy I knew who worked in restaurants of 1985 La Mission Haut-Brion, a great Bordeaux, and 55 was 30 years old from their wedding year. And it cost, the price I was quoted was $185. And I was like, oh my God, $200 for a bottle of wine? That's insane. But it was within, you know, it was something that I could splurge on. Nowadays, that bottle would be worth, you know, $4,000 or something like that. And bottle a great old Bordeaux like that would be out of my splurge zone, unfortunately. But it was worth it to me because the meaning and the memories of that bottle have always stayed with me, and I write about that.
Didn't you mention your mom had put the bottle up on the shelf and
yeah,
saved it?
She still has the bottle, and it's near a portrait of my dad. And but you know, that's the context of wine, and that's why context is so important, and why wine is so meaningful. I mean, I don't remember the water we drank that night, and if we had you know, a beer or something, probably wouldn't remember that either. But this bottle represented something, and it was deep and memorable, and in the whole context of that evening, it was incredibly worth the price. And this is why, you know, one of the reasons I always try to think of wine not in isolation, but as part of this a tableau with food and family and friends, and it's an environment in which wine is always a part, like bread or salt. It's a staple of this gathering, and that helps give it meaning.
You had mentioned on the other side of the coin a memorable meal with friends where it was a cheaper bottle of wine that was just revolutionary. You were cooking together, and that bottle just stayed with you as well.
Well, that was kind of I was a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, and friends and we'd get together and cook at night, and we always had a bottle of wine on the table, and you know, we had the typical graduate student budget. And so we bought a lot of cheap wine from wherever, and without really thinking about it, it was just there and it was fun and we liked it. But for one reason or another, I bought a bottle of wine. In this Austin, Texas, it was the very first Whole Foods, that I remember. Now it's gone on to world domination, but back then it was just a little health food place in Texas with people smoking weed in the parking lot. But they had a wine selection, and it was a good wine selection. And we were having, some pasta or something, so I bought an Italian bottle, and it turned out to be so different from anything else. For $8, I never forgot it. It was a Barbera d'Alba from Giacomo Conterno, 1978, and I didn't know who that was, but it turned out that he's one of the great producers of Barolo and Barbera from that region in the Piemonte region of Italy. And it was so different and intense that I thought, that's an experience that I have to have again and again and again, which is, it was that same kind of selfish attitude that got me interested in food in the first place. Great meals that are such a pleasure that you don't want to leave that experience to chance.
And I did, as someone that writes about food and drink as well, I loved that you started with food really well, or beer, rather, if we're going to go back further. It started with a love of that.
Well, it's a long story, but I got into food. I was a teenager growing up in suburban Long Island, and I was home for the summer, just me and my parents. My sister was at summer camp, and I had my first girlfriend, and this was incredibly powerful feeling. The hormones were flying everywhere, and my parents decided they were going to go to Paris, and this was a great thing. They had maybe been to Europe once before, and they were going to take me. This was not a great thing because I have to leave Joan Goldstein behind somewhere. But I went along, and I was just like a sullen, nasty little teenager. And my father was going out to lunch with some buddies who worked at the newspaper. He worked for a newspaper, and he knew people who worked for the International Herald Tribune. And my mother said, you take him. And so he took me to lunch with his friends. And the restaurant is still there in Paris, Bistro Allard. And I remember the meal. It was entrecôte, which is a rib steak, and haricot vert, green beans, and gratin dauphinoise, a potato dish. And the flavors were just so vivid and alive, and it's so different from what I had been eating in 70s America, where my parents liked food, but it was still the era of instant coffee and TV dinners, which was a big thing because they had a brownie in the middle, and it was so meaningful. And I remember there was a bottle of wine on the table, red wine, and I had a taste. And again, it was just part of the scene. And there I was, with my father and his friends, and I wanted to do that again and again. So I got into food and more into beer at first. This was back in the 70s, so my first writing experience was doing beer reviews for my high school newspaper, which was nobody seemed to mind. Nobody said a thing. Nobody complained. Maybe no faculty member were reading us. We were a revolutionary newspaper.
The times have unfortunately changed.
Yeah. Well, now I have kids, and of course I would be appalled if they did such a thing.
Sure. We're winding down here before we'll start getting into more of your questions, but one other point that I really appreciated was you describing humility as crucial to wine tasting. There's that sense of adventure, but on the other side of that, just humility. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. you know, it brings me back to tasting notes for a moment, because the reason, one of the reasons that we try to nail down every flavor and aroma that's in a wine is because we want to master it in a sense. We want to ferret out every element of it and demonstrate our control over it. But if you really think about wine, and good wine, it's subject to so many processes that are outside of our control. The weather, simply the production of it. And if you think about the way wine is made, if you're going to mass produce wine, you have to behave, again, like the franchise restaurants, where you want to eliminate any sort of distinctive element. You're after consistency, and so you have to control everything. So you want to decide in advance what that wine is going to taste like, and do whatever is necessary, whether it means adding elements or subtracting elements, going through a factory process to create what you're after. But great wine, I don't believe, is made like that. Great wine is made by almost allowing the natural process to take place. You try to guide and direct the wine along a certain path, but you're not the boss of it. And wine is going to go its own way, subject to the vagaries of vintage and what you've done in the vineyard, how long you waited to harvest the grapes, or if you harvested early. It's all of these decisions that you've made are going to influence the wine, but you can't control it. And I think that's where great wines come from seeding the idea that wine is going to be under the direct thumbprint of human, and allowing it to, in a sense, express itself, subject to our own guidance, of course, but we don't have the final say. So if you are a farmer, you understand that the weather is outside of your control. If you're a winemaker, you understand that you can hope for the direction the wine is going to take, but you can't absolutely control it if you want to make great wine. And as a consumer, you don't know exactly how that wine is going to behave as you age it. You don't know. There is no one exact peak moment to drink that wine. There could be many good moments along the way. And if you just allow that wine is not a certain sure thing, but it's actually an ambiguous thing that you can't always predict. Great wine is almost on a tightrope where it might fall over one side or the other, and it's the tension of this balancing act that can make great wine thrilling. But if you suddenly put that net under there and tie the safety rope to the leg, and you kind of lose a little bit of the thrill. You gain certainty, but you lose the thrill.
I really appreciate everyone's questions. There's so many. I wish we could get to all of them. I did want to get to a really pressing one here. What's the craziest thing you've ever done under the influence of awesome wine?
There are people in this room who might be able to answer that question better than I. I'll just say maybe opening another bottle.
Good answer.
That I hadn't planned on.
Safe answer. We'll ask the family members and friends later. Also, there's a question about Rieslings, asking if they're a lost cause for the American palate.
Oh, no.
I know. I'm a huge Riesling fan myself, but on the drier side. But it says, I love Rieslings, but hardly anyone wants to drink them with me.
Oh,
So we have someone here that needs
you know,
some
I bet
drinking
you would
buddies.
find a lot of volunteers in this room to share those bottles. I mean, the fact is that for years, people, sommeliers and wine writers were sort of crying out the greatness of Riesling, and it fell on deaf ears. And that changed in the last 10 years or so, and Riesling, next to Pinot Noir, has been kind of the fastest growing grape or wine in this country. And there are so many good Rieslings from around the world, and more in this country. And believe it or not, I'm not being provincial here, but the greatest American Rieslings come from the Finger Lakes of New York State. And I don't know how available they are here, but there are certain producers like Ravines or Herman Wiemer that are so good that they're really worth checking out. Other areas, believe it or not, I've had really good Rieslings from Michigan. And you can't get them pretty much except when you're in Michigan, but one day you might be able to, and you should look out for them. And you do have some good Rieslings in California too, and Washington.
What wines, regions, or varietals are exciting you lately? What's the latest?
Well, I'm kind of obsessed right now with Sicily. This is, again, you know, we've been talking about regions that have just exploded on the global stage in the last 10 or 20 years. I don't know if there's any region more than Sicily that has gone from nothing, you know, a reputation for bad jug wines and awful sweet wines to making some of the most exciting wines in the world right now. You know, and some of them come from the slopes of Mount Etna, a truly active volcano that, you know, it could explode any time. And I don't know what these guys are thinking of planting these vineyards there.
Talk about the tightrope.
Yeah.
They're living on it.
But you know, Nerello Mascalese grapes are making fantastic wines. In eastern Sicily, Cerosuolo di Vittoria, wonderful wines. And I'm also obsessed with Sherry, which is an old wine story, and maybe just the tip of a rejuvenation there. It's certainly happening in London and in New York City, and I bet it's happening here in San Francisco a little bit too.
One question is that I've heard what you first taste on your palate are the tastes that you experience when you're growing up, and that influences the way you taste as you grow older. I don't know if there's a scientific answer to that.
You know, if that were true, I guess we'd all love those wines that taste like milk. I don't know. I mean,
it's a good thing we evolve, right? We just keep tasting to keep evolving, right?
yeah,
Get
I
beyond
think
that.
people's tastes most definitely evolve. You know, in the old days, there was a fairly predictable arc where, you know, you might, when I started learning about wines, you went directly to Bordeaux because that was widely considered the greatest wine in the world, and it had this kind of easy to understand hierarchy, and you knew what wines were considered the best and the second best, and so on. And then eventually you explored some more, and you might end up in Burgundy, which is a little bit more complicated, and somehow you would oscillate between the two, or you would be a Burgundy or a Bordeaux person. Now it's more complicated because people start in our country at least with New World wines, and some people are fine there. Some people go on to different experiences. New World wines tend to be fruitier and occasionally a little bit sweeter, and people will find Old World wines, as a rule, if they taste them side by side, tartar or more astringent. But some people evolve in that way. Other people don't.
If you are up for naming names, who have been some of your favorite wine and food writers over the years?
Well, I tend to, I love inspirational wine works, and by that I don't mean, aphorisms that make me feel good, but works that make me thirsty or hungry. So, right here in the Bay Area, one of the greatest wine books ever in our country is Kermit Lynch's book, Adventures on the Wine Route. I never remember if it's on the wine route or along the wine route, but that was that was published almost 25 years ago, and it's still in print and about to have a anniversary edition. Hugh Johnson's memoir. Hugh Johnson, I think, is the greatest wine writer. Uncorked is a great book. A book that I wish I had written. It was just came out last year about Sicily, and this tells the story of modern Sicilian culture through wine producers, and it draws on the intersection between culture and wine. It's called Palmento by Robert Camuto, Camuto, and it's really, for me, it hits all the right notes of food, wine, history, music, great writing.
Excellent. I'll have to check that one out. So what are the top 3 qualities to look for in a good wine is another question, and I don't know if we can summarize it in 3, but...
That's, that's hard because that gets to the point of demystification, and people's tastes are different. I like wines that have structure to them, that aren't just soft and don't seem flabby to me. Other people would experience what I call structure as being that sort of astringency, tannic or acidic. And I also tend to like wines that are less fruity, more earthy, savory wines. That's one of my favorite qualities in a wine.
Absolutely. All right. Unfortunately, we are winding down here, so we have time for maybe one more. What is your opinion of organic wines and that trend?
Well, organic is a strange word as it applies to American wines, because virtually no wines technically qualify in this country to be called organic. And I forget what the precise element that they can't have in them is. It may be sulfur, but it may be another widely used quality that just I'll just say you almost never see wines that can legally be labeled organic. But the question may have to do with organic grapes, and I personally feel that this is a great thing. The more farming, the more natural farming that we can do, the less dependent on chemicals, poisons really, on your crops, poison fertilizers that kill the life in the soil. I think that's healthier for everybody, and I think it ultimately makes better wine in the long run. So I applaud wines that are, whether they're technically or legally organic or just strive to be in a non-bureaucratic way. I think that's a great movement.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I know there's more questions I couldn't get to, but Eric will be here after a little bit, or
yeah.
will you? Yes, so you can ask him yourself directly, and thank you so much for these excellent questions. So our thanks to you, Eric. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Please check out his book, How to Love Wine. We also thank our audiences here and on television, radio, and the internet. I'm Virginia Miller, head food and drink writer of the SF Bay Guardian and The Perfect Spot. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.